this episode of the Wagging Tails podcast. I'm Fraser, here with my co-host Jay. Tonight's topic is one that we get asked about a lot. Should I neuter my male dog? In fact, I literally got asked this just before I came home to record this podcast. So my answer to them was, listen to the podcast. That's how common it is, literally every day. So the thing is, I'm not a medical vet. Jay's not a medical vet.
Not yet.
As much as people always talk about it, we're not going to talk about the medical side of things. There's a lot of things that people talk about, like, neutering them too early impacts their growth plates, and not neutering them impacts their risk of prostate cancer, all that sort of stuff. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're also not going to talk about population control, trap neuter release programs, or laws or rules around neutering. What we are going to be talking about is behaviour. So as a canine behaviour consultant myself and a dog trainer, and having an avid obsession with psychology and behavioural science and how dogs' brains work, it makes more sense for me to dive deep into the behavioural impact of neutering male dogs rather than anything else.
So many of you know, both of us have Singapore specials of our own. Fraser has 3 boys. I have 2 girls. So this episode, we're only going to be talking about the boys. So Don't worry about it. We'll have the next episode where we'll talk about the girls as well. But just remember, for this one, since it's just neutering, many people are told neutering will solve their dog's behavior issues. But does it really? What does testosterone actually do for a lot of male dogs' behavior? That's what we're going to be talking about in this episode.
So that's kind of the point, is that the reason we've got to do the boys and girls separately, as it were, is that we're different. So it's not as if we're being one-sided or the other. We've got to separate this into males and females because, hormones are different between the sexes. It's just the way it is. There's no two ways about it. So when we talk about testosterone, what does it actually do? Well, from a behavioural standpoint, because testosterone is the key to many functions within male mammals and of course male dogs, which we're talking about, but we are going to be focusing on behaviour. So it affects everything from confidence levels, it affects everything from focus. In fact, there's a great study which actually mentions, I can't remember which one it actually is, it'll come to me later on, but there's a great study that actually says that 5% increase in focus with dogs that have got a longer duration of being exposed to testosterone. So either having waited longer to be neutered rather than being neutered very, very young. So a lot of this with regards to confidence, boldness, focus, all of that sort of stuff in the development during adolescence stage is very, very important. And research does show that testosterone plays a massive role in developing that boldness and confidence within our dogs. And without it, dogs would struggle and do struggle with fear-based behaviours.
Yep. So notice how Fraser says boldness. There's no dominance. There's no alpha theory that we're talking about here, because this is truly based off of neutering by itself. And then it's a huge myth that, if kept intact, dogs are more alpha, or however you like to put it. There are studies out there that we'll post in the session notes as well, publishing things like the Vet Journal that will give you a very good picture on this. If you guys really have the time to and you're interested in, please go look up the links that we'll post. Dogs with high levels of testosterone tend to show more assertiveness, that's the word I'm going to be using, or more risk-taking behaviors. These can be both positive and negative, depending on the context that you're looking at. This really does not mean that if a dog has more testosterone equals more aggression. No, that's completely untrue. Often it means the dog can be more confident, which can make a difference in their entire ability to how they would handle stress. So they could be less aggressive, actually.
The thing we've got to remember here is that although testosterone's role in behavioural development is very impactful, I do want to make it very clear that it's not the only thing that impacts the development of our dogs. So you've got you've got genetics, you've got learned behavior, and you've got social behavior. So the behavior of those around your dog, whether that be humans or other dogs, that makes a difference to their development and how they act. The behavior is also impacted by what your dog learns, whether that be positive or negative. This is where things like early socialization and appropriate socialization come in. Because if you can create a positive association to many different things, that impacts their behavior as well. Genetics, you've got everything from the type of animal, of course, but we're talking about dogs. So you've got breed traits, you've got the prenatal stressors, postnatal stressors, things that will actually impact them at a genetic level. But of course, part of that is shaped by their hormones and the way that their hormones are built and the way their hormones are secreted within the body. So those three areas are very closely linked because it does actually have an impact. But with that said, let's talk about the role in behaviour development of testosterone. So the behaviour development in young male dogs is very closely tied to hormonal shifts, and this is more because of during their puberty, their development and growth actually has a massive testosterone boost. It's not just about reproductive behaviour, although you will see that with young dogs as well. In fact, I think I might have told the story of a young Aramis swimming to a different island on Sentosa on the dog beach to get to a female dog that was in heat. So it's very impactful in that sense. But it's also essential for their development in not just confidence and focus, as I mentioned, but also things like resilience, social interactions, grit, their ability to problem solve, all of that stuff so that they don't get bored. They've got more ability to actually solve things and really learn things a little bit quicker. So that's something to bear in mind as well, is that with a prolonged exposure to testosterone, it may even actually be easier for training, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. So one of the studies that I did want to mention is it's McGreevy et al. 2018. So if anyone's interested in looking that up, it's definitely worth a read, or certainly if you don't want to read the whole thing, looking at the synopsis of it. But in this, they did a study on 6,000 dogs to look at the behavioural differences between neutered and intact dogs. And they found that intact males, which means they had a longer exposure to testosterone, actually held better attention spans and they had a greater ability to focus during training, as I just mentioned, and especially during their early development phases, they were able to be redirected away from things that would normally have created issues for them. They also found that these dogs that had the prolonged exposure to testosterone were less likely to develop the 27 behavioural problems which they actually studied. I'm not going to list them all out, of course, but within those 27 behaviours, 7 of those were aggression-based issues like leash reactivity, dog reactivity, human reactivity, things like that, territorial, things like that. They all had significantly less impact on the dogs that had a prolonged duration to testosterone. Now, this doesn't mean that dogs that have not going to be neutered are not going to get these. It just means that within that study of 6,000 dogs, which, by the way, is a very good pool of dogs for any academic study. They're not normally that big, to be honest. So it did show that, and it was very interesting to have seen that. So when people say neuter your dog to fix the behavioural problems, we've got to be aware that it's not as simple as that. It's actually quite an old-fashioned way of thinking. It's a very difficult way of thinking to change because most people that still think that will fight tooth and nail. But if you ask them, what's the evidence behind that? they'll come up with a lot of anecdotal evidence, but they'll struggle, really struggle, to find any actual behavioural science evidence or any academic studies that have been done to show that. So, of course, neutering can sometimes be seen as anecdotally helpful, but in my experience, and of course in what these studies are reflecting, that neutering can actually have the opposite effect, especially in dogs that already lack confidence. So if you've got a dog that's got a genetic element which gives them a predisposition to be anxious or skittish, like any dog who has been developed as a street dog, whether that be Singapore Special, Hong Kong Special, Romanian street dog, these dogs are more likely to be genetically more skittish, more aware of their surroundings to make sure they're not going to be getting into any trouble. And by neutering them early, we're potentially making that an even more impactful behavioural problem. So the behavioural challenges that comes along with neutering are more complex than just saying, oh, I want to stop the humping, I want to stop the marking, I want to stop aggression. By removing testosterone too early, you actually decrease you decrease the dog's confidence and focus, and you're increasing fear-based reactivity, which of course is something we all want to try and avoid.
Like since Fraser was talking about how neutering too early affects your dogs, I'm going to be talking about how neutering doesn't fix your problems, and it shouldn't be a solution. You shouldn't look at it as a solution, as a quick fix to any behavioral issues that you're currently experiencing with your dogs, whether in the past or in the future. It's like Fraser said, it's a very old school way of thinking. Can you imagine that if we, as a society, we just decided that acts of aggression, acts of extreme aggression, will be met with castration for us, for people, for men? Don't you think that do you think that's going to solve the issue? Oh no, the men will just be even more scared. They're just going to be scared to do it. So neutering will not fix all of your common issues. Like, let's say your dog is marking everywhere, or your dog is humping, mounting, or your dog has aggression issues. These behaviors aren't always linked to purely just testosterone. Yes, it could be one of the contributing factors, but it's not a way to solve those issues. A lot of the time, and when I say a lot, I really mean like a lot, these are actually just learned behaviors. So have you we do have male dogs, you might have them as well, some of you might have encountered this as well, that don't lift their legs when they pee. They squat down like a girl. So marking is a very good example. It's not always about hormones. It's more of the time regarding their habits, their territory, what they have learned growing up. Neutering might not stop it, especially if that behavior is already so deeply ingrained into your dog. So don't think that this is going to fix your dog. The vet journal study that I referenced earlier was showed that even with neutering, a lot of behavioral traits like boldness were more influenced by the dog's environment and training rather than just hormones. So it's good to have a good amount of confidence built. That's why we always say to not neuter too early, and then engage the dog in training. Make sure that the dog has a good environment growing up and the right form of training. That's why in Noble Canine, we always advocate for training and behavioral modification first, with regards to behavioral issues, of course. Like Fraser said, so we won't go into the medical side of things. We're not vets. So neutering should never be the go-to solution for behavioral issues. And just because I'm saying all this, I'm not telling you to not neuter your dog. Fraser's 3 boys are neutered. Both my girls are spayed as well. So there are many other factors, such as population control, adoption rules, government, whatever it is. But understand what it can and can't do with regards to your dog's behavior, especially for a lot of younger dogs who are still developing. Neutering too early might stunt their growth, both behaviorally, emotionally, and yeah.
So that kind of leads us on to the behavioural impacts of early neutering, because you mentioned about population control, and most places in the world, when you adopt a dog, they will insist that you get your dog neutered, which is completely fine. As much as we're talking about all of this, personally, I actually do agree that all adopted dogs that are, especially adopted dogs that are street dogs, should be neutered to ensure that population control is monitored and reduced, because the last thing we want is more dogs up in the shelters, more dogs out on the streets. So I do completely get that, but it is a very hot topic. So I'm going to reiterate this, that for all of those that have adopted dogs from any animal welfare group, early neutering is something of a problem. So we are looking at this from a strictly behavioural viewpoint. We are not here to tell any AWGs, any animal welfare groups, that what they're stating and what they're insisting on is right or wrong. We are telling you this from a behavioural standpoint, which of course may impact the number of dogs that have successful rehomings, would impact the number of dogs that can be behaviourally rehabilitated, but that's not for us to dictate. We're just telling you as it is from the behaviour science and from canine psychology. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, early neutering before a dog reaches full sexual maturity. So a lot of you guys out there will have heard people saying, oh, you've got to neuter your dog at 6 months. You've got to neuter your dog at 8 months. You've got to neuter your dog at a year. Your dog doesn't reach full sexual maturity until around about 18 months. So as much as it would be very difficult to try and convince every animal welfare group when you adopt to let you wait till then, but that would be the ideal scenario. So this early neutering has been linked to some pretty significant behavioural changes. So I'm going to reference McGreevy et al. 2018 again here, because it is actually a very good study. And it found that the early neutering of dogs actually has a significant increase in all fear-based reactivity, even in dogs that might not have originally had that. But if you neuter that dog during their fear imprint period, if you neuter that dog within that adolescent period where they're doing socialization and things like that, it can become way more fearful of all novel stimuli. So that means, excuse me, people, other dogs, traffic, things like that can lead to real fear-based reactivity, which can lead to aggression. The other study I wanted to mention was Tong et al. 2019. I'll put if I've not already, I think I have that one. Yes. So
Yep.
Tong et al. Is the role of testosterone in behavioural neuroscience. And although they do look at dogs within this study, they look at a whole range of different mammals. I think the original study was done on rats, and then they moved on to other animals as well with this. So what they found in this study was that if you removed the stabilization effect of testosterone on behavior, if you remove that too soon, you're going to see heightened anxiety. And anxiety is more often than not the root of many behavioral challenges. And these are the behaviors that people are a lot of the time trying to fix by neutering their dogs. So things like separation anxiety, leash reactivity, other aggression-based behaviors, as well as things like peeing out of fear. Like a lot of people think that their dogs are marking in the house. Actually, it could be an anxiety-based issue. A lot of people think humping is a testosterone-based issue, but actually it might be social awkwardness. So if your dog is needing to be more sociable and more confident in social situations, and what you decide to do is neuter them and they get less testosterone, it might actually make things worse. So that's kind of a very interesting sort of factor that they found within that study. And as I say, these studies will be in the show notes for those listening on the podcast front, and for those listening on Facebook, they are in the comment section as well. Now, a great example of this, which was kind of a mistake in a way, or not a mistake, but more of a chancel thing, is our dog Aramis, who is just at my feet. There's 3 of them all around me, so I've got to check which one's where. Now, Aramis, unfortunately, has a liver issue. So when he was young and he was struggling with that, he wasn't strong enough to be neutered. He couldn't go under the anaesthetic because that would have impacted his liver. So he didn't get neutered until he was much stronger and healthier. And that was at 2.5 years old. Now, Jay will attest to this. Cheryl will attest to this in the comments. And basically anybody that's met Aramis will attest that despite being a street dog, he's one of the most confident and chilled out dogs you'll ever meet. And as much as I would like to say that that was down to the massive amount of behavioural training that we did with him, I have a feeling a lot of it has to do with the fact that he had 2.5 years exposure to the levels of testosterone that he was naturally supposed to have. Now, as opposed to Athos and Aramis, who I did make sure they got at least 12 months because I was quite dead set on that. Yeah. Compared to Aramis, they don't have the same level of zen. You know, it's not the same.
No one has the same level as zen as Aramis.
Well, to be honest, I mean, Aramis genuinely, there's been times where like there'll be a huge crack of thunder and I will jump and get shocked. He doesn't care.
He looks at you like you're crazy.
Exactly. He's a funny lad. But yeah, so let's take a look now. No, before we do this, Jay, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sorry. So testosterone plays a role in a dog's ability to solve problems and help them remain focused under stress. If you take that away too early, you usually see dogs become worse in terms of behavior. Like they become more hyperactive, they become more unfocused, they become more reactive. Essentially the opposite of what you were trying to achieve with neutering. It's a huge issue with behavior problems, because a lot of the times we ask the owners of like our clients who have very skittish dogs, anxious dogs, hyperactive dogs, or reactive dogs, like, oh, when was your dog neutered? And then they give us the craziest numbers. I've heard one that was neutered at like 5 months old or something like that.
Yeah,
I'm like, wow, that's crazy, you know.
That's way too young. I mean, the youngest I've come across was 6 months. And that dog was honestly a bit of a nervous wreck. Now, I'm not saying that it was all because of the neutering, but certainly that's going to have an impact. You know what I mean? It's even worse when you think about how historically everybody was always sort of advised to neuter their dogs that early.
Yeah.
You know? And a lot of people still are advised to that because, like everything else, if you've got a medical vet that you're seeing who's very old school, a lot of the advice that they will give you is also very old school.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a funny way thing. Okay, so let's look at this from more of a training aspect as well. We've looked at the behavioural. That's kind of what I love looking into that, and I could talk about that all day. But let's take a look at training impacts with neutering. So the takeaway here is that if your dog is showing behaviour issues, training and behavioural management should certainly be your first step. With regards to behaviour, neutering should be a thoughtful decision, and it should be made in consideration of the dog's development and behaviour. It's not a quick fix. Your dog's not going to become magically well trained because you've chopped off their gonads. It's just not the way the world works. And as we said earlier, it might actually make it more challenging to train them because they'll be lacking focus and potentially lacking confidence, which can make things a lot more challenging because you've got to build up that trust in an anxious dog before you can really get into the meat and potatoes of doing proper training. You end up starting off with a lot of behavior modification, a lot of behavior shaping, and a lot of trust building exercises before you can actually get really deep into the training aspect. So, behavior modification and confidence building exercises, they are far more effective alongside training focused on solving the problems, are way more effective than actually just chopping off the gonads. And that's especially true for dogs that struggle with fear based or anxiety driven behavior before that's happened. So make sure that if you've got a puppy that's struggling with anxiety, that's struggling with any fear based things, separation anxiety, barking at like other dogs, make sure that you're doing everything you can, such as appropriate socialization, proper puppy
Confidence
training,
building. Yeah.
yeah, social building, confidence building, trust building, all of that good stuff before you consider even looking at castrating them as part of your behavior solving issues. In fact, the thing is that there's even some places where you must get approval from your vet and behaviorist to get dogs castrated. And this is more in Scandinavian countries where castration of animals is seen as mutilation and cruelty to animals. Now, I'm not saying that that makes them right and everybody else wrong. It's just interesting that there are places that are thinking along those lines. So make sure that you are not jumping to things too quickly because it is an irreversible surgery at the end of the day.
Yeah, like Fraser said. So training, behavior management, and versus neutering. Over here at what we do at Noble Canine is we always talk to our clients about our four-tiered approach to a lot of behavior modification training for dogs. So the first one is physical management, which comes in the form of things like, you might be using gates, you might have to use a muzzle, you might have to separate a dog from their trigger quite a lot. You might have to put yourself in between your dog and anything that's causing them to be reactive. There's also training solutions, which is pretty straightforward. It comes in the form of training. Behavioral adjustment training, which is different from your standard obedience training. So behavioral adjustment training is basically a lot of your positive pairings, your reinforcements, your counter conditioning, and as well as your conceptual rehab, which is something that actually a lot of dogs require. Yeah, if you think about things 20 years ago, it wasn't as much as how much behavior training dogs require now. But I think that's also because like we start to understand more and more about dogs as time goes on. So 20 years ago, you see a dog um barking at someone, and then you might be thinking, this dog's just going crazy, something like that. But then now we start to understand why the dog is doing that, showcasing that behavior, why they're acting that way. So I really hope that this doesn't stop like this progress moving forward in terms of canine cognition, in terms of behavior. It goes to a much higher level as well. And who knows, we might have, honestly, clients that know us years ago and know us now, we still update them with different ways to train your dog. Like whatever we told you back then, tell you, hey, you know what, we found a better way to do things. We read some studies, we went to some conventions or whatever it is. We keep ourselves up to date so that we can keep our clients up to date. We don't want them doing the same things that we did 10 years ago. So neutering doesn't fit neatly into any of those any of our four-tiered approach. So you have to think of it as more of an external factor. So something that should be considered as part of a broader plan or part of your medical reasons, not as the solution.
You know, we're not making light of this. We're not taking one side or the other here. We're just stating it as it is. I want to make that very, very clear because a lot of people will have something to say about this and they will try and argue. And most of the arguments are going to be medical or social. So I'm just going to make that big disclaimer again before we start wrapping up that the fact of the matter is this is only to look at behaviour. We are not here to talk about the medical side or the social side or the legal side of things. But it's certainly not something that's going to cure your dog straight away just by getting it castrated.
Yep. Excuse me. So I know it's a short episode, guys, but we like we said, we only talked about the behavioral aspect for this. If we were to dive deeper into into a lot of other things, I think this episode could be 3 hours long. So we before we started going live on Facebook, we were talking to each other already, and we said that okay, we'll just stick to these things because these are what we're experts on. These are things that we know, we've experienced as well, and what we focus on. So I just want to leave you guys with this. Neutering might change some aspects of your dog's behavior, but it's not a fix. So and when I say change, it could go either way. It could be better, it could be worse. So not all of the changes can be positive. Your dog's, for example, your dog's confidence, the ability to focus and their resilience are all something that you have to do. You have to put the time in and the training hours in, not just because when you neuter your dog, there's hormone changes. So if your dog, male dog in this instance, is struggling with behavioral issues, please consider behavior modification and training first. Speak to an approved behavioral consultant or behavioral trainer. Work on the root causes, and then don't rely on neutering as a quick fix. Ensure that you're doing it. I always tell my clients this: do it because it's a medical reason, not because you want a quick fix.
Yeah, and that's the thing is this is a slightly shorter episode. And when I was going through things and putting together some of the show notes for today, I realized that I could have gone incredibly deep, even just with behavior, even just with how things like work in the brain. And I kind of realized that if I started talking about how testosterone impacts the chemical reaction in the amygdala in the brain and things like that, that's going to turn a lot of people off. You don't want to go so deep into the behavioral science that it makes it unclear, which is one of the reasons why we tried to keep this fairly simple. But at the same time, guys, if you're interested and you want to go deep, I have put the studies that we referenced in the episode into the show notes, not the show nuts. That's a Freudian slip with this episode. Into the show notes and into the comments for those of you that are watching on Facebook. So do have a look at those. And if you fancy having a deeper, more geeky conversation about it, I am more than happy to do so. I'm a bit weird that way. But the thing is we only spoke about male dogs this time. Now, female dogs, that's a different kettle of fish. And I think a lot of people will be interested, even if they don't have female dogs and they've got male dogs, just having a look at the difference between the two is quite fascinating. So for that, tune into our upcoming podcast, which will be on the 16th of October. We're doing these every 2 weeks. And we're going to dive into the behavioural impact of spaying so that you know on a similar aspect how this is impacting female dogs. If you would like to support the podcast and the work that we do at Noble Canine, the biggest thing you guys can do for us is follow us on social media, like the posts, share the posts if you feel up to it, That's a massive, massive help. Those are also in the show notes. The links to all of our social media and our YouTube are in the show notes. There's also a wealth of information on there for anybody that needs it. All the podcasts are up there, as well as different educational videos and articles and posts and everything else that we do. And if you really love us, please consider signing up to our Patreon, because that makes it much easier for us to improve this podcast, to improve the way that we gain more evidence, to improve the way that we can get guests on, we can get higher profile guests on, things like that. So do have a think about that if you're up for it. And with all of that said, guys, if you get any questions on any of this, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thanks for joining us tonight.